I'm really glad that I and we dubbed this event a workshop and not a conference. So it's very tentative work that I'm going to present. Only 2 or 3 people have seen it. There's no excuse. I'd say fire away at what I say, but that's the idea. I'm going to present some ideas about what it is to explain extremism. If we, could you press the? Right. Now, if you look at the literature on extremism and related phenomena like fanaticism and terrorism, fundamentalism and conspiracism, we see a wide variety of sometimes seemingly conflicting explanations. Some scholars appeal to macro factors like economic, social, political, cultural developments, others to meso factors like group dynamics or group identity, and some people, of course, to micro factors like beliefs, desires, narratives, but also psychopathology. I'm going to do something different because there are enough explanations out there. I'm going to do something different, namely take a philosophical or bird's eye point of view. And the aim of my talk today is to get a better grip on what it is that we're doing in seeking explanations of extremism, terrorism, and the like. Is it to provide necessary and sufficient conditions, to identify conditions that render extremism more likely, or yet something else? And I think doing so matters for at least 3 reasons. So the first one I already mentioned, namely this wide variety of sometimes seemingly conflicting explanation. But the second one is that some people have suggested that it may not be possible at all to try to, or you may try, but you won't succeed in explaining extremism. So Mark Sageman is, of course, a well-known figure here, and he's talked about the stagnation of the field. And in one of his publications, he says that, quote, despite over a decade of government funding and thousands of newcomers to the field of terrorist research, we are no closer to answering the simple question of what leads a person to turn to political violence. And John Horgan goes even further when he argues that we should seek interpretations rather than explanations of terrorism, because according to him, any particular terrorist incident is by its very nature incident specific, right? So it's determined by its specific circumstances and its specific context. And I take these people to be making not so much a metaphysical point. It's not that there is no explanation. It's not a matter of pure luck or necessity. It's just that it's really hard or maybe impossible to find such an explanation. On the other hand, though, we find lots of people who do provide explanations. People like Martha Crenshaw in terms of terrorism being a product of strategic choice, or Kees van der Bos at Utrecht University, whom some of you met yesterday, in terms of perceived injustices. And these are just 2 out of dozens of explanations out there. Right, so what's going on here? A third and final reason is that I think we need to have a better grip on what we're doing in seeking explanations because of prevention purposes or cultivating resilience or de-radicalization purposes. The better we understand what we're doing when we seek explanations, the better we will be able to take effective countermeasures or when it comes to de-radicalization and prevention. All right, the talk is structured as follows. I'm first going to say a couple of things about what we're seeking to explain. So what is the explanandum? What are the explanandum? Then something on what it is to explain extremist behavior and belief. Then something on kinds of explanations that you find out there. Then something on the semantics of explanation. And finally, based on what I'm going to share with you, I'm going to provide a couple of guidelines. And I hope that this will be helpful to people in the field. Let's see. Final comment before we really get started is that I'll try to zoom in on extremism. But I take it that these like theoretical or philosophical questions are rather structurally similar across the domains of extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism, conspiracism, fanaticism, maybe cults as well. We'll see about that. But so of course, specific explanations may vary from field to field, but the big philosophical questions, like what it is that we're doing in seeking explanations, are I think quite similar. But I'll zoom in mostly on extremism. All right. So first, what is the explanandum? When we look at popular work and also academic work, we find phrases like what explains extremism, or the explanation of extremist behavior is that, or a proper explanation for conspiracy theorizing. Phrases like that. And I think those phrases are highly ambiguous and misleading. For in many cases, it's not at all clear what they seek to explain. And I think there are numerous options here, and you can distinguish them, for instance, by way of their subject. So who's an extremist, or what is an extremist? The dimension, are we talking about action, about belief, about affection? The phase of being involved, the role in the movement, time and place, and other things. So here's a little overview of explananda that I bumped into, and this is just a pretty random selection, not meant to be exhaustive at all. So the subject could be a person, could be a group or an institution, like the Russian government, for instance. We could seek to explain people's extremist beliefs or extremist actions, their grievances, like perceived injustice, a person radicalizing, becoming more extremist, the phase, like getting involved, being involved, joining, starting a new movement, the role, a lot of work on roles recently, like financially supporting, recruiting, actually performing violent actions, providing ideological justification. Time and place, so a particular region, for instance, or something's being widespread, or the fact that it's possible in the Western world, given certain conditions, what is the explanation of that? And of course, you can combine each of these in various ways. So this is not meant to be exhaustive. These are not even these categories. These are just some examples. And I think being explicit about the explanandum is important for at least 3 reasons. First, it matters to the issue of the very possibility of an explanation. So remember that Horgan says that any terrorist incident is by its nature context-specific, and on that basis he argues it might not be possible for us to give an explanation. But it does not follow from this, even if he is right, that we cannot explain terrorism in any sense. Right? So we may not be able to explain a specific terrorist attack, a violent attack, but we might be able to explain specific features of terrorist movements or the rise of a terrorist movement in a particular country in a particular time period. Right. So that is helpful, making these distinctions among explananda when it comes to the very possibility. It also matters, secondly, for the nature of an explanation. So take the issue of epistemic vices or cognitive vices like narrow-mindedness and dogmatism, and take the topic of contemporary conspiracy theorizing in the United States, like the work of Sophia. If we seek to explain why Alex Jones radicalized, became more of a conspiratorial thinker over the last few years, you may well appeal to his character, his intellectual or cognitive character traits, like dogmatism or narrow-mindedness or suspiciousness or credulity or things like that. But if you seek to explain the rise of conspiracy theorizing in the United States over the last 5 years, then appealing to the cognitive vices of the people involved will not do as an explanation, even if a lot or most or even all of them do actually display such vices, because then the question is, well, how come that there's been an increase in those vices? So there's something superficial about that explanation, right? So what the nature of the explanation is partly determined by the exact explanandum, so what is potentially relevant. And the third and final reason has to do with the scope of factors, even on the same level. So to use another example from John Horgan, there's a difference between getting involved in a terrorist movement, and there you may appeal to factors like emotional vulnerability, identification with victims, sense of reward, and so on, and staying involved. And here you might want to appeal to different factors, things like ideology, influence of a leader, and so on, or the one may be more dominant or more prevalent for the one explanandum in comparison with the other. So that's why I think this matters. The other point I wanted to make is that when it comes to the explanandum, we need to pay attention to the contrast. So I think explanations are by their very nature contrastive. So, for instance, an explanation can tell us why Salafi jihadism grew stronger in Western Europe after 9/11 in comparison with the preceding years, so prior to 9/11. Or you can seek to explain why Salafi jihadism grew in Western Europe after 9/11 rather than being stagnant or declining, or while left-wing extremism did not, or while it did not in Southern America. And here the explananda are different, and of course the explanations will be different. So being explicit about the explanandum really pays off, I think. All right, so that's the first point I wanted to make. Now, on to maybe the core question. What is it to explain something? And particularly, what is it to explain extremism? Well, to explain something is to state why it exists or why it occurs, rather than what it is, as Hempel and Oppenheim pointed out. I think there's also a sense of explaining what something is, but that's not the sense we're considering today. But what is it to state why something exists or why it occurs? Before I give my own answer to this question, let's briefly consider Carl Hempel's view, because I think it's misleading, but it's helpful to see why it is misleading. So he says that to explain is to provide, quote, an argument to the effect that the phenomenon to be explained was to be expected in virtue of certain explanatory facts. And I think this is inaccurate. It's false for paradigm cases of explanation. So Charles Darwin, of course, famously provided an explanation of biological diversity in terms of random mutation natural selection. Yet that theory does as such not make specific predictions, not about the emergence of particular species or let alone individuals or populations. Or what explains why a particular patient has lung cancer is that he smoked for 40 years. Yet smoking does not render it likely that one will attract lung cancer. It renders it more likely and significantly more likely, but not as such likely, right? So it doesn't have much predictive power in that sense. So what I think this shows is that something can be a proper explanation even if it doesn't have predictive power. So what is it then to explain something? My suggestion would be that to explain something is to specify the conditions distinct from the thing to be explained, as nothing explains itself, that significantly increase the likelihood that it exists or obtains. And I think this meshes well with a threefold distinction that we find in the literature, namely between a causal explanation, a causal explanation, a unifying explanation, and a reason explanation. A causal explanation states the factors that jointly bring about X, right? Such as for a car crash, a heart attack, and the surroundings, and so on. A unifying explanation tells us how something can be considered a special case of a more general phenomenon. Now, I don't think that is particularly helpful for explaining extremism. So you could say, for instance, why has conspiracy theorizing been on the rise in Texas over the last 5 years? And you could reply, well, it's been on the rise in the United States as a whole over the last 5 years. Then, of course, the question still is, well, why is that the case? So more helpful maybe is, in addition to a causal explanation, a reason explanation, a third kind, where a reason explanation tells a person's reasons, desires, goals, affections, and other mental states. So, for instance, in explaining the Oklahoma City bombing, we can appeal to Timothy McVeigh's belief that, for instance, the US government wrongly restricted the rights of citizens, for instance, when it came to the Second Amendment. Let me be explicit that there are, of course, full and partial explanations. So full explanations give all the relevant factors, whereas partial explanations only some of them. And I think it should be clear that when it comes to extremism, it's the partial explanations and not the full explanations that are relevant. There's nobody out there who thinks that they can provide that they can state all the relevant factors. Right, so we've got partial causal explanation and partial reason explanation, and out of the totality of possible explanations that seem relevant to explaining extremism. And I think one important idea is that the fuller an explanation is, the better. So, for instance, I mentioned Kees van der Bos's explanation of extremism and radicalization in particular in terms of perceived injustices, and I think that's wonderful work. But now take Beatrice de Graaf's recent account, the radical redemption model, which also states those perceived injustices, but adds something like a sense of deficit or a sense of guilt or shortcoming. So I think that it counts as a fuller explanation, not a full explanation, but fuller than the partial one, because it explains, a lot of people will perceive injustices, but only relatively few out of them will actually take steps to redeem themselves, right? And if you add a shortcoming, and if there's enough empirical evidence for that, then that provides a better explanation. Right, so we can think of explanations as something that comes in degrees, something René and I wrote on. And the higher up the scale it is, the better, when we're talking about the same explanandum. Causal explanations can, of course, also be partial. So think of social structural explanations. A well-known example of that in the literature is, for instance, women working part-time. Well, if you ask them why they work part-time, they will give reasons. They may even be good, of course, good reasons in certain circumstances. But a fuller explanation will appeal, for instance, or might appeal to macro factors, like how easy it is for someone in a particular position, for instance, having children, to work full-time, right? Final thought is, you might wonder how this phenomenon of explaining relates to other activities that we pursue in academic research, like describing, predicting, interpreting, understanding, and so on. And these, I mean, this would require more than a talk of its own. But just to be clear about this, I take it that explaining is way more specific than describing. It's describing why something occurred or why it took place. Prediction is a future-oriented activity, and we saw that explanations can come with predictive power. Sometimes they do, and it's terrific, but sometimes they don't, and that is not necessarily a deficiency. Interpreting may be ambiguous between explaining and understanding. Understanding is widely taken to be more than just knowledge. It comes with seeing patterns, for instance. So one option is that understanding is just a variety of explanation. You understand why something occurs. But another option is that it is something like understanding extremism or understanding fundamentalism, which might be something like seeing patterns across movements, or maybe even something like gaining access to and making sense of the meaning that individuals can find in extremist movements or in QAnon. That's roughly how I understand the relations between these. All right, so we've got an idea about why we should pay attention to explananda and what it is to explain. Now let's have a closer look at the kinds of explanation that we find for extremism in the literature. As I already said, it's a common distinction between macro, meso, and micro factors, so I will stick to that distinction. And if you look at the literature, you will find numerous ones under each of these. So under macro level factors, you will find socioeconomic factors like poverty and social isolation, social factors like restoring dignity, cultural political factors like capitalist imperialism. On the meso level, we find, so that's the group level basically, especially larger groups, things like group dynamics, group identity, group loyalty, group bounds, social identity, collective rationality, strategic choice. And at the micro level, we find things like psychological factors, vices, thinking styles, affections, grievances, ideology and religious belief, narratives, as Beatrice de Graaf's recent work on radical redemption, religiosity, Lorne's work, among others, coping mechanisms such as escape from personal problems. I think that's also in your work, Sophia. Medical and psychiatric factors. So a whole list of factors. You'll find some of them over here, right? And so there's macro, meso, and micro level, and there's third-person explanation and first-person explanation. So third-person explanations are roughly those in terms of things that a person would not herself appeal to in explaining or justifying their behavior, whereas things like belief, argumentation, so reason, narrative, religiosity are the things that people would appeal to. They're accessible from a first-person perspective. Now, if you look at the literature, many accounts will actually, of course, combine various levels and elements on different levels. So to give you two examples, Gabriel Ellman, Scott Appleby, and Emmanuel Stevens, so all somehow involved with the fundamentalism project in 1991, 1995. They argue that a particular fundamentalist movement's shape and form is explained by three factors, and they call this the structure, chance, choice framework. So structural factors like long-term contextual conditions and changes like conflict with other religions or war, economic crises, things like that. Contingent chance factors like the death of a leader, and human factors of choice and leadership. And they actually think that this is individually necessary and jointly sufficient, a bold claim, but it's an example to show that in real life people often try to combine these factors. Another example is Sofia Moskalenko and Clara Macaulay in their book Friction, where they identify, if I'm right, 13, how much is it? 12. All right, I had 13. Okay, 12 forces, and among them are such things as group grievance, love, risk and status, slippery slope, unfreezing, already mentioned earlier today, group polarization, and so on. And you might think that these also display the distinctions that I mentioned. So things like love, risk, status seeking would be micro-level factors, whereas things like group isolation, intergroup competition are meso or even macro-level factors. All right, now why does this matter? I think this whole thing matters for three reasons. So paying attention to the levels of explanation, the kinds of first and third person explanation, and the specific explanations that we find within each of these categories. I think that matters for a couple of reasons. So first, it raises the issue of which ones are compatible or even complementary and which ones are not. So Sophia already mentioned that we find more psychopathology these days, psychopathological explanations then as well for embracing QAnon. And that raises issues about the compatibility of such explanations, so mental illness explanations, on the one hand, and first-person explanations in terms of beliefs and reasoning. So if some people maybe are deluded, is that compatible with an explanation in terms of reasons and the narratives? Or are these people thereby misguided about why they do something? Right? So this raises questions about compatibility. The second one is that it helps us to identify where we've been able to make progress and where we've not been able to make progress, and what work remains to be done. So I think relatively little attention has been paid, and I think Lauren would agree about this, to religious narratives, for instance, or religiosity, or orthopraxis, or understanding QAnon as a religion, for instance. What would that amount to, and how does it help explain it? And it will point us to theoretical gaps. So I think there's been quite a bit of attention in the literature to group grievances, but maybe less to group belief. And I think here we can just draw in resources from other fields, and I thought of, unsurprisingly, social epistemology, which is concerned with such things as group belief. And I think that matters because social epistemology teaches us, most would agree, that group belief is quite different from the belief of the members, or even like the collection of the beliefs of the members. So it's possible for a group to believe something, and in a way to act on that, even if many or most, or maybe sometimes all members don't believe that thing. And in the Q&A I can give more examples of this. So I think it's also possible for a group, for instance, to be ignorant of something while all the members individually know. A striking fact. So what does that mean for explanations in terms of group belief? So it points us to important theoretical gaps. And let's move on and consider the semantics of explanation. And I think it's important to pay attention to the semantics, because if we look at the literature, we'll see that there is a wide variety of terms. And it's not clear to me that these terms, or the things that they refer to, do actually do explanatory work, or whether they should be better understood as describing features of movements, for instance. So what do I have in mind? Well, I have in mind terms like driver, determinant, mechanism, factor, condition, enabling condition, influence, cause, root cause, favorite combination, reason, incentive, motive, motivation, motivational force, trigger, origin, pathway, catalyst, indicator, base. I'll stop there. You get the point. There's just a bewildering variety of terms, and often we have no idea of exactly what they amount to. I mean, we can give particular examples. I've given a few here. You'll find these in the literature, and one could easily fill the gaps and add further examples. But what does it mean to say of ideology that it is a catalyst, or that something is an indicator? What does it actually amount to? What do we mean by that? And are some of these terms reducible to one another? I think if we study these in more detail, I think they can mostly be reduced to one of the following options. I think many of these identify a condition that, if met, makes it more likely that acts obtained. So in this case, say extremism, or a particular feature of a terrorist movement, or something like that. So a word like indicator seems a primary term here. It just makes it more likely, doesn't contribute to the likelihood as such, right? So there's just correlation, not necessarily causation. I think, and a lot of that is actually precisely that. We just describe a movement, and we find this more often with a movement than on average, or in mainstream movements that are not radical. But of course, there are some of these also describe things that actually contribute to the likelihood. Some of them are micro level, first-person perspective, things like reasons, right? Reasons that individuals have. Some of them are micro level and third-person perspective, mostly I think, like things like determinant for individuals. Some of them are ambiguous between first and third-person perspective. Also on a micro level, like motive. I think there's going to be a special issue edited by John Horgan on motive. And there are macro level conditions that also render extremism more likely. Things like root cause, I think they're best situated on a macro level. And there, some of these terms describe something that you could call a set of temporally successive structured conditions that are thought to jointly bring about extremism, things like pathway or root or mechanism. And then, of course, for each case, we'll have to consider whether that is actually the case, so whether these things bring about the extremism in question, or whether it's just a description of how someone actually came to be an extremist, without thereby having really explained what contributed to the extremism. So again, we should be careful to pay attention to the difference between correlation and causation here. All right. It's time for a couple of guidelines and conclusions based on what I've said so far. I think if I'm right about these things, we can maybe derive 4 or 5 guidelines. First, I think we should delineate as sharply as we can between describing, understanding, interpreting, explaining, and predicting. And where these overlap, it's, I think, helpful to be explicit about what we're doing and to explain why they overlap. And I think that is important because they come with their own success criteria. So I think there are some splendid accounts in the literature out there that, for instance, describe extremism, that are presented as explanations of extremism, right? There's nothing wrong with them, it's just that they're not explanations, they're just descriptions. Second, I think we should be explicit as we can about the explanandum and also the contrast. So what is the thing we're trying to explain, and what as opposed to what? And that means paying attention to things like the exact subject, the metaphysical dimension, the phase, the role time, and so on. And if we do that, I think we'll be better able to properly compare various explanations that may be rival explanations or maybe complementary explanations. Third, I think we should seek explanations. We should seek levels and kinds of explanations that fit the explanandum. So, for instance, explanations of extremism at the individual level that only appeal to macro factors, like social and economic conditions, are likely to overlook something in the same way as it holds the other way around. So if you explain something merely by appeal to a person's beliefs, you may overlook the macro factors that explain why that person held that belief in the first place or contributed to that belief. Fourth, I think we need to adopt and clarify relevant terminology from the semantic field of explanation. So I think it's fine to use terms. I have no problem with any of these terms, really, that I distinguished earlier on, as long as it's made explicit what they are supposed to be and how they are supposed to function in an account that means to explain extremism. And finally, something that I haven't said anything about so far, but since we're in the business of providing guidelines anyway, I thought let's add this one. I think we should make the core terms in our explanations operationalizable and derive testable hypotheses from the explanation. We should seek that. That's not always possible. We should seek and pursue it. So, for instance, it's wonderful to try to explain something in terms of perceived injustices, but can we actually operationalize that notion? And similarly for religiosity, right? The more we're able to do so, the better. All right, it's time to wrap up. What I've argued doesn't really, I think, point us in the direction of a particular explanation, not even in the direction of a particular combination of explanations. Which one or which ones are viable will depend, of course, on the evidence base and also on how we should balance desiderata like explanatory power, explanatory scope, simplicity, coherence with background knowledge, precision, fecundity, and things like that. Yet I hope that my contribution today takes a small but important step in what is needed to get such explanations off the ground. Thank you so much.